right, let's talk about why getting a graduate school degree in counseling or clinical psychology, especially if you're en route to a doctoral degree like a PsyD or a PhD, why it's so time-consuming and stressful, and what makes it difficult for that to change. So firstly, we should talk about the historical context of higher education institutions. They were originally developed to cater to the needs of white men from highly economically privileged backgrounds, people who had lots of outside structural support and who could dedicate all the time that they needed to their scholarly and academic pursuits. They did not need to hold part-time or even full-time jobs in addition to their studies. They could focus full-time on their academics. They didn't have to support family members economically back home, right? They were not stretched thin in terms of time or money. They were well-resourced. And so universities were set up to assume that students would have all the bandwidth they needed to fully devote themselves to their studies and not to multitask with other things. And that historical legacy lives on, even though universities, and particularly some programs, have evolved or started in mind to try and be more accommodating to students who come from less privileged backgrounds. But that historical legacy is still hard to completely move away from. And so let's talk about time that is taken up by a typical graduate student's degree requirements. And so firstly, we have classes, right? And typically it's standard to take 4 full courses, full 3 credit hour courses. And courses vary in how much time investment are needed, right? How much time you need to spend on average per week in the course. But you might have heard that typical rule of thumb that for every credit you take, you should expect 3 hours of work a week. And so if it's a 3 credit class, then that's 9 hours of work per week that you can expect to do readings and projects and assignments and stuff like that. I think in practice, on average, a typical 3 credit hour course probably requires about 6 hours of work a week. So we'll use that rule of thumb. So if it's 6 hours of work per class times 4 classes in a given semester, 6 times 4 is 24. So we've got 24 hours out of, say, the typical 40-day work week. That's a benchmark for a lot of people. We've got 24 hours of that, more than half, that are already taken up with classes, right? And so already that's a big chunk of the work. But what's beyond that? In counseling and clinical psych, especially once you get beyond your first year and you start to have to be completing clinical practica, which is where you're on-site at a mental health agency, and you have to be there for about 10 to 20 hours a week on-site, providing clinical services to clients, attending staff meetings, having supervision meetings, that sort of thing. That's another 10 to 20 hours on top of that, even accounting for the 3 credit hour practicum course that you may be enrolled in. And so already we're going from 24 hours to a minimum of 34 hours, but oftentimes as many as 44 hours. So we'll say, somewhere in the 40 to 45 hours a week range, now that we've added clinical practicum to the picture. And then after adding clinical practicum, then we've got to talk about assistantships. So if we're, say, at about 40 hours already worth of class and prac, if we round it to that nice fair number, then we've got assistantships next. And like I said, historically, assistantships did not have to be a thing. Scholarships, free money, perhaps. Fellowships, perhaps. But assistantships, if you were rich, you wouldn't need to do an assistantship. But these days, in some graduate programs, but not others, it just really depends on the nature and history of the program, But typically, master's program, terminal, standalone master's programs, there's not an expectation that the students in counseling psych master's programs get funding. Some may be able to achieve that, but it's not the norm, not the majority of people. But it's, of course, nice if you're in a terminal master's program where you can get that 20-hour-a-week full-time funding, which waives your tuition, typically gives you a small monthly stipend, and may entitle you to fringe benefits like health insurance and whatnot. So when it comes to assistantships, if you're fully funded, I should mention too that for doctoral programs, like PhD programs in counseling and clinical psych, typically everybody is funded by assistantships, or maybe the occasional person by a scholarship or a fellowship. But usually it's assistantships for most people, which can be teaching assistantships, research assistantships, or graduate assistantships. And with those things, a full-time assistantship means you give the university 20 hours a week of your time, and then you get those aforementioned benefits. And so, and I should say that PsyD programs, so doctoral counseling psych or clinical psych programs that are PsyD based, those students tend not to have assistantships. So they're more like master's programs in that way. So if you do have an assistantship, then that is another 20 hours a week, which in practice tends to be, so some assistantships, they're the full 20 hours. You're liable to clock in for 20 hours. Some may be as low as 10 or less if they don't do a good job of getting work in the students' hands. But I would say the average amount of time someone spends on a full-time 20-hour-a-week assistantship is probably about 15 hours. So if we're going to be conservative, we could say 20 hours, but in practice, if we say it's about 15, then let's see. We take our 40 hours a week from class work plus clinical work in most years, and then you add another 15 hours. That is 55 hours. All right, so already we're at 55 hours of work per week for those three things alone. And now if you're in a PhD program and supposed to be getting involved in research, or if you're in a master's program and hoping to go on to a PhD program, and so you're getting involved in research as a master's student, then there's this pressure, there's expectation, this incentive to get involved in a research lab, on a research team, whether it's working on your own research or working on other people's research. But that itself can be another 5 to 20 hours a week, depending on how much research experience you're trying to get with that, or what's expected. And so let's say, again, to be kind of in the middle, let's say 10 hours a week of research. So already we're at about 65, 55 plus 10 is 65 hours per week if you're involving the research component. So very quickly you can see how all these time commitments add up to create this very, very busy schedule. And this is a more kind of conservative estimate of time spent, but if we look at how much time can be taken up, if it's the full extent, then it's, if we do 3 hours of work per week per credit hour, and you have 12 credit hours, and 12 credit hours times 3 in practice work weeks, then that is 36 hours a week of class related stuff. And then if you're doing a 20-hour week practicum arrangement, then that's 36 plus 20 is 56. And then if you're doing an assistantship for 20 hours a week, then that's 56 to 76 hours. So already we're almost at and we haven't even done research, and so add in 10 hours of research, and so 86. So already we have 86 hours a week of work, and we haven't even accounted for leisure stuff, right? And so you can see how it adds up quickly. And when graduate students talk about being stressed with graduate school and all the work that goes into it, this is why, right? There's so many things we need to work on, and we haven't even accounted for so far in this math the time that you need to spend on other life stuff, social time, sleeping time, exercise time, cooking and preparing and eating meals, all these other things that are important for a healthy, sustainable life. You need to be finding time for that. And so if you have 70, 80-hour work weeks, but the work week was only designed to be 40 hours a week, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, then where are people getting that extra time? Well, it's eating up their weeknights, it's eating up their weekends, and so it's directly competing with the other life stuff that is really important for people to have time for. And so this is why people are stretched thin and stressed and can be experiencing a lot of self-doubt, understandably, about where they're supposed to be able to find the time to do all these things, and why there becomes this necessity to find ways to cut corners and find efficiencies and not spend as much time on readings as they might normally. And it just creates this ecosystem that's not very sustainable, not very compassionate, and certainly doesn't leave much room for the everyday catastrophes of life that suck up our bandwidth, like sickness and injury and having to support family and other things. And so when anything goes wrong, and then you have to be attending to these other things for a period of time, and so your work backs up week to week, then it can just spiral out of control. And so life is imperfect and catastrophes happen. And so those further throw this out of the loop. So if you're living check to check, so to speak, on hours spent taking care of things, and then you have a bad week, it can throw the whole semester into being behind, feeling behind on everything. And it just really sucks. And so with this context about like, why does graduate school life feel so busy, we can then pivot to talking about, so if it's not particularly sustainable or healthy, why don't we change that? How can we make it different so it is a more humane enterprise? Because it should be a more humane enterprise, and we desperately need to make it sustainable so we can bring more folks into the profession. So that's a natural, healthy reaction for students to have, and they rightfully will say, this doesn't feel good. Why is it this way? It shouldn't have to be this way, right? Can it be different? Can we make it better? And so students understandably say like, hey, can we make this better? And so when it comes to us, as speaking for myself as a faculty member, and particularly a director of both our master's and our doctoral program at the time of this recording, I take very seriously looking at opportunities to make life more humane for our students, because it shouldn't be in a just, ethical world. It shouldn't be this taxing to get a master's degree if you want to go on to a doctorate, or and get your PhD in particular. And so, if we ask the question of how could things be made better, let's think about our options, right? Let's think about what's possible, what's not possible, and who the interested parties are and the relevant systems, such as accreditation, university requirements, protocols, policies, procedures, practices, licensure board requirements, policies, and practices, and other related systems that shape what things are possible to adjust. Okay, so let's pivot to that next. So, for example, let's take classes. Classes take up a lot of time at the graduate level, right? Remember that quote of 36 hours a week. And I should name too that, like, in practice, to survive your life, I don't think it's advisable to spend 36 hours a week on 12 credits worth of classes. I think students need to be very judicious with their time, and sometimes look for opportunities for synergy and simplicity and skimming instead of deep reading certain things, and all of these strategies they can use to reduce their time per week spent on courses, because you've got to find the time wherever you can to make life more livable, right? So I'll name that. And I think I've had other recordings that, depending on who you are that's listening to this, I have other recordings that speak to that, like strategies for managing this hidden curriculum in terms of reducing time spent on courses. But how do we, simplify the course workload? So let's think about that, right? So first thing, it is standard to take 4 classes a semester. And in a 2-year, 48 credit hour, let's talk at the master's level first. In a master's program, 48 credit hour, 2 years, pretty standard. For those master's in counseling psychology programs where they live in a state where the counseling psych people can possibly become licensed counselors by going after graduation to the counseling board and asking to be grandfathered in as counselors despite not getting a counseling degree, because remember, counseling psychology is a psychology degree. Psychology is a completely separate profession from the profession of counseling. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. So some counseling psych programs may be in states where they can go get licensed at the master's level, and in that case, the standard degree is 60 credit hours, 3 years, with that 3rd year being a clinical internship where you're earning about 360 clinical hours over the course of that year seeing clients, and that's what helps make you eligible for licensure at the master's level in most states as a counselor. And so those programs will be slightly different. But for our standard 2-year, 48 credit hour master's program, the common practice is for 3 credit hours a semester. And so if you as a student decide to take fewer classes, that may look like underperformance to potential doctoral. So if we're talking about our program as a doctoral prep master's program, and most students, and the students we try and bring into the program, want to go on to doctorate degrees, the faculty at these doctoral programs where you'd be applying, they're looking for students to take a classic full load, which is 4 courses. And so if they see you taking less than 4 courses a year, they may wonder why. Now, does there have to be a stigma around that? No, there shouldn't be, but there might be. And so right there, already there's an incentive for students to take a full 12 credit course load. Now, UK considers full-time student status to be achieved at 9 hours or greater. So it's okay in the eyes of the university to have 9+ credit hours a semester. That is okay. You can maintain full-time student status, which matters for student loan stuff and assistantship eligibility and yada, yada, yada. All these systems connected to this. But it may not look as good to doctoral faculty who are evaluating your PhD application, right? And so if that's the case, then you're incentivized to take the full course load. So, okay, there's some dangers with taking less than the 4 total classes. So be that as it may, what else can we do to simplify classes? Well, maybe we can reduce the amount of work in each given 3 credit hour standard class, right? So if you got to take 4 classes, well, can we make each of those 4 classes less rigorous, less overall time spent on task outside of class. So we'll talk about that possibility and opportunities and challenges with that next. So what if we reduce the number of work in each class? Well, what dictates what stuff is covered or how much stuff is covered in a given course? Well, there are a few considerations, right? The first is that we are trying to prepare students for practicum, right? We are trying to prepare students to be ready to perform at an adequate clinical level. And for folks coming in straight without a master's degree into a master's program or a PhD, that first year you're learning a lot of essential therapy skills, and then typically in your second year you are starting clinical practicum and seeing real people, real clients who have real clinical needs. And in order to help them effectively, you need to have baseline competence in the core counseling techniques, and you have to know a theory of change, a theory of psychotherapy well enough to help that give some structure and quality to the work that you're doing with someone, some long-term vision to guide that work. And you need a basic understanding of how we think about mental health distress and illness and classifications and common issues like depression and anxiety, as knowing what stuff a person is dealing with can help determine what sort of treatment approach might be a good fit for them. And importantly, in a lot of agencies, you have to be able to provide a clinical diagnosis in order for insurance to be covered, in order for you to be authorized to provide services. That documentation is essential. So you need to know how to diagnose. You need to know how to not harm people who are culturally similar or different from you. And so you need to have some multicultural competency and sensitivity and humility. And so we need to bring students up to a certain baseline around that cultural awareness. You need to know the core basic ethics of our profession so that you know how to keep confidentiality front and center, how to navigate multiple relationships, and how to think about these principles and standards so that we do not harm our clients and do right by our clients and function well in an organizational environment and behave in manners that are ethically expected. So all of this knowledge, you really do need to have a core, strong foundation in it before starting to see clients. Otherwise, you risk doing great harm to other human beings. And so if you're going to start seeing clients in year 2, that means we got to train you up on all the essential stuff in 2 semesters, in 30 weeks, right? And so that is something that we keep in mind, because we also get feedback from on-site clinical supervisors who work at these mental health agencies where our students do practicum, and we get feedback from them year over year, and we see how well our students are evaluated on different competencies clinically that get measured on these evaluations of students. And we get informal feedback through our conversations with on-site training directors and on-site clinical supervisors. And we have learned, we've gotten feedback that, hey, your students don't know X, Y, or Z well enough. You need to make sure you train them better in X, Y, or Z before they get here. And so over years and years and decades of training students, we have gotten a better and better sense of where we need to increase the rigor and intensity and breadth and depth of the training around certain skills. And so we've made a lot of strides, and we've hit a good point, but there's still feedback that we're getting and adjustments we're needing to make to further adjust things so that we're training students in what they need so that they can show up in the necessary way. And a question could be, well, why don't you push back when, like, well, if that's too much to do in a year, why don't you delay when people start completing practicum, so they have more time in which to learn the foundational skills, so that there's less pressure to learn things quickly. And of course, the issue with that is that it extends time to degree, because it's a national standard that we expect programs, and everybody expects programs to be done in 2 years, or if it's going to be something that can lead to licensure at the master's level, like if you can become a counselor, that typically requires that someone do a robust clinical internship experience for a semester or a year, and so that typically falls in a third year. So master's programs are already 2 to 3 years, and if we were to go slower, it would require the programs becoming 3 or 4 years. And that, in my experience, is even less attractive to potential students than having a rigorous and busy 2 to 3 years, right? So if you've got to pick your poison, if you've got to pick a trade-off, if you've got to think about what is the best compromise, then that is typically where the best compromise is. So that is how we think about that. So that is why we don't want to go slower. We just have to be efficient with how we do things. And so that is why we don't try to do less. And that is some of what influences what we attempt to cover in a given span of time. So someone might say, well, aside from those core classes that you need prior to starting practicum, why can't you, put less content in the other courses that come throughout the rest of the program? So if it's a master's program, that come in the second year, and if it's the PhD program, that come in subsequent years, because maybe there's some stuff that you're supposed to ideally get exposure to by the end of your degree, but you may not need it at the very start prior to prac. And so that can be things like vocational psychology, group counseling, social justice consultation and evaluation, some stats courses, some research method courses, courses like that. So with those courses, why don't we teach less in those things, or maybe even ditch some of those courses? And so here are some things that we need to think about related to that. One thing is licensure. So licensure for psychologists at the doctoral level has a pretty standardized set of classes across most states, where most states require a core set of classes, and they expect to see on the transcript 3 credit-hour courses in topics such as techniques, theories, diagnosis, and then the domain-specific, and then the discipline-specific knowledge, kind of gen eds of psychology, of like developmental, social, physiological, psychometrics and measurement, stuff like that. So those gen eds, and then of course all the core counseling skills. And so a lot of these classes that you see on, say, a master's or a doctoral program of study, if the class is required, for most of those required courses, those are courses that licensure boards expect to see on a transcript. And you cannot be eligible to apply for psychologist licensure in that state if you haven't taken a 3-credit course on that thing. So that is definitely why we like to make sure that we are teaching all of the required courses and having students complete all the required courses that most licensure boards expect to see on transcripts. And so we can't cut a lot of these classes because licensure boards need to see that on the transcript. And similarly, beyond licensure boards, there also needs to be accreditation. So American Psychological Association, the Commission on Accreditation, has standards of accreditation and then implementing regulations that talk about how to put those standards into practice. And so they articulate a set of competencies that they expect students to learn by the end of their doctoral degree, and soon APA will start accrediting master's programs as well. And master's programs will also be then tied to these accreditation standards. And certainly for a doctoral prep master's programs like ours, we are training people and having them take the courses that we know they'll eventually need to have accomplished to be able to graduate with a doctoral degree. So, the master's program is not trying to have them take courses that will not be useful to them as doctoral students. So we're trying to make it very efficient in that way. And so accreditation also expects to see courses that cover each of these topics, and you have to be very specific with how the courses you make available cover the required competencies for all students, including all the prac experiences that are typically multi-year commitments in a program. So you've got licensure, and then you've got accreditation, who say, we need to see evidence that you are teaching and assessing students in this large suite of competencies. And so that really dictates why there's so many courses to take. And that's why for someone who, say, comes straight out of their bachelor's degree and wants to complete the PhD and get their master's along the way in counseling psych, that's why like the first 3 years, the first 6 semesters are typically 4 3-credit classes at a time. So it's like the first 3 years are booked solid with stuff. Now, certainly why we need to be able to show the American Psychological Association the syllabi of all these courses, which they review. And so we've got to make sure that these syllabi look to an external reviewer like they rigorously teach these concepts. So it's not enough to say like, oh yeah, we've got a 3-credit course in that, and they see the name of the course and like, oh, that seems relevant. But APA will actually look over syllabi, and they will want to see rigorous syllabi that where these courses at the doctoral level, you're expected at the graduate level, these sources, they're supposed to use peer-reviewed journal article sources for a lot of the required readings. It's supposed to be directly from the evidence base rather than just like book chapters or textbooks. They want to see it directly from the peer-reviewed literature that are the required readings. They want to see rigorous assignments. They want to see weekly course topics that cover the right sub-elements of a given course and don't leave out important topics. So there's a fair bit of scrutiny on us to make sure that we're teaching each of these courses that are considered essential for counseling psychology and often clinical psych at the right level of depth. And so that is why we're really mindful of trying to create and teach courses that have rigorous content in them. And so that can limit how much content we feel like we could cut out or slim down from a course. You can shuffle some content from course to course, but there's a set of competencies and skills that practicum sites expect, that licensure boards expect, that accreditation agencies expect, and that we need to make sure our students are learning and demonstrating competence in. So that's why it can be hard to cut content out of classes or oversimplify that content, because it ends up punishing the program and punishing the student and being a barrier to their ability to get practicum placements and get predoctoral psychology internships and get future jobs. And so that's just some of the stuff you need to know around classes, of like, why are there so many classes? Why are they so rigorous? Why is there so much work associated with them? That it's because we have to think about these sources of oversight that are looking for excellence and rigor in our courses. So at this point, we have talked about what all the requirements are and the typical obligations for a typical graduate student in counseling or clinical psych. including coursework and prac and assistantship and research, and how that can get up to 60, 80 hours a week easily. And then after that, we talked about why are there so many courses, and why do we have to take so many courses during a given semester, and talked about things like licensure requirements and APA accreditation requirements and institutional university degree requirements and things like that, where there's a high degree of oversight to make sure that we cover all of these courses that we need to cover, and cover all the content, and that they're taught rigorously. So basically, it's very difficult to reduce the number of courses. It's very difficult to reduce the amount of content taught in these courses. And as time goes on and we learn more about psychology, generally that means we need to cover more things rather than fewer things. And so the amount of knowledge and competencies we need to train people in is typically only ever expanding rather than reducing. And so basically, it's really hard to reduce the workload associated with classes, right? In terms of the workload associated with practicum, there's a few considerations. One is that if you're getting a doctorate, you will need to accrue a certain number of face-to-face client hours, intervention, assessment, in order to be competitive and eligible to apply for a predoctoral psychology internship towards the end of your doctoral degree. Typically, most applicants have 400 to 500 direct hours by the time they're applying for internship, and that takes some time to accrue. And so that creates an upward pressure to ensure that students are doing enough practicum years, enough semesters of practicum, and spending enough time on site at these practicum sites to ensure they get those direct hours so that they have a fair shot at getting matched with an internship agency when they apply for internship. Likewise, for licensure, states require you to have a certain number of predoctoral psychology internship hours, and then some states have requirements for the number of predoctoral, meaning hours earned prior to internship, the number of predoctoral psychology hours you might accrue. And so the fewer hours we have students accrue during the doctoral program, the more hours they would have to accrue as a postdoctoral scholar before they can become licensed. And so that's also a disincentive, and therefore an incentive to make sure our students have more rather than fewer hours. So those are some, and then just in general, the more time spent working with clients, the more you develop your clinical skills, your ability to articulate your theory of change and your approach to treatment. And that sophistication and that ability is important for making a good impression in your written internship application materials and in your internship interviews, and then certainly when you're applying for jobs and you have to articulate your clinical skills to whoever you're trying to impress to be able to be given a job offer if that's the way you're going. So again, there is a pressure to get good experience, substantive experience, so that you come across as a polished professional. So those are some of the reasons why it's really difficult to reduce the footprint, the weekly time spent on practicum stuff, on on-site prac. Now, it certainly is true that there are better and worse prac sites, better and worse fits, and some prac sites help students maximize direct hours and minimize support hours, though there is a necessary balance to that. But some sites are pretty heavy on indirect hours, and those are a little less efficient for earning hours, and generally that can be a little less attractive than sites that offer a lot of direct hours. But again, you don't want to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction. And so there is certainly room for improvement sometimes to help practicum sites who your program is affiliated with try to achieve a good, healthy balance of direct versus indirect hours so that they're not indirect heavy and therefore a little less useful for students typically. But again, programs have limited ability to tell practicum agencies how to run their own show, right? You got to be diplomatic. You have to know your limits. You have to be careful not to tell people their business because they won't like you and want to do business with you. So there are limits to how much a program can pressure a practicum site to change their practicum model, though there is certainly room for persuasion, diplomacy, and advocacy, which is a good thing to do. Another thing to consider that works against reducing the footprint is that practicum agencies generally have to onboard prac students to the agency. They have to spend time training up students to make sure they do good work. They know their protocols, they know their workflows, they know their clinical documentation systems. All that takes time. And it takes a stock amount of time. And so that's why a lot of agencies want students to be on site for at least 2 or more full business days, because they have to invest a lot of time and energy into training up students, and they want to get a good return on that investment. They want to make sure these practicum students are seeing lots of clients to help justify the time it took to train the students. And so when you shrink the amount of time you spend on site, you shrink the amount of client hours a practicum student is providing to the agency, that starts to make that training client contact ratio be poorer for the site. And so sites would rather prac students spend more time on site rather than less time on site, generally. And so that also limits the ability of programs to put a hard cap on how much time students spend at practicum. Generally, it's harder to convince sites to do less than what's typically standard, because a lot of sites want at minimum 1 full business day, typically 1.5 to 2 full business days per week of prac work on site to make that investment output ratio feel favorable and sustainable to the site. So that's an example of some of the pressures that make it hard to create a lighter practicum experience at most sites for most students during most of their training. Later in students' training, of course, you can get into prac light situations where they might just do a little bit of stuff, but that's another story for another time. So that's a little bit about prac side of things. So now let's talk about assistantships. We talked about how assistantships, you've got to put in 15 to 20 hours a week to get the monthly stipend and the tuition remission and the fringe benefits like medical insurance. And then with fellowships, that's just free money, typically on the basis of merit or group membership in certain marginalized groups. Now, in an ideal world, we would have higher taxes on rich people and on wealthy corporations, and we would use that tax money to subsidize, partially or fully, the cost of college and graduate training. We could do that if we wanted to, if that was our priority in this world, if that was our priority in the United States. We could do that. But that is not our nation's current priority for a whole host of reasons that are beyond our scope on this recording. But it means that there is insufficient funding for higher education, and there is insufficient public funding and university funding to support graduate students. There's not enough money to give more people fellowships. And there are limited money to pay to create and fund assistantships even. Because while some assistantships pay for themselves, the amount of labor that the student puts in creates enough monetary value for the university or the unit that it justifies the cost. A lot of assistantships do not pay for themselves. A lot of assistantships could be done more cheaply by a part-time university employee rather than a 20-hour-a-week graduate assistantship. And the big reason is that a part-time employee is not going to cost the university thousands and thousands of dollars in tuition, which is something that graduate assistantships are designed to cover. Therefore, because assistantships are not always cost neutral, and there is usually a limit on how many assistantships a unit can justify creating and funding, that of course creates a downward pressure that limits the number of assistantships that can be offered to graduate students. And so we see that there will be a limit on free money and fellowships, and even a limit on assistantships. And with assistantships, again, that's typically 15 to 20 hours of work a week that one must do in order to get that tuition remission and that monthly stipend, etc. And so, again, it is hard to reduce the workload associated with assistantships because many of them already are not cost neutral. And so being able to fully waive someone's tuition and give them a monthly stipend for, say, 5 to 10 hours a week for the same compensation would be fiscally even more difficult to pull off because of these structural reasons. And if we better funded public education and prioritized the mental health professions and ensuring that we had a robust mental health profession workforce, then we would get more tax dollars and we would put that towards paying the way for more students. But that is not currently how it is set up in our country. And so here again, it's really difficult to reduce time spent on assistantship stuff for these various reasons. Having talked about the limits and the constraints on reducing time spent on coursework, on practicum, and on assistantships, we now turn to the last piece, which is research. There are a few considerations when it comes to research. We'll talk about them separately for master's and doc. If you're in a master's program with aspirations to get into a doctoral PhD program, the big metric of success for a lot of applicants for PhD programs is what their CV and their personal statement suggest about their future promise as people to contribute to research, as researchers. And so the way in which you demonstrate that you have knowledge and skill and the ability to be productive and accomplish things in the research domain is by getting involved in research. Typically getting involved in a research team or a research lab where you're helping out. And sometimes it may be possible to you take the lead and then get support or supervision or guidance from faculty members or research labs. So some combination of first author work and supporting author work. And so in order to gain these skills, in order to demonstrate this productivity, of course you got to put the time in to research. And the more time you put in, the more robust your CV will be, the more skills and experiences you can claim to have, the more posters you might be able to present or manuscripts you might be able to join as a co-author on. And so that takes time to accomplish that. And so you want to have a better chance to get into a PhD, counseling psych or clinical psych program, the more there is an upward pressure to put in the time on research rather than to minimize that time. And likewise, at the doctoral level, if you are in a PhD and some PsyD programs, though the expectation is less, certainly for PhD programs, half of the competency that you're generally expected to master is the scientist role, right? When we think about the dominant PhD model of training, it's called the scientist practitioner model, where half of what you're learning is to be a scientist and do research, and the other half is to be a practitioner, a clinician, and sometimes an advocate, depending on the model. So with that in mind, you are going to have to be assessed on your scientist skills, and you will have to learn those skills. And so that will generally require you to do research portfolios or qualifying exams or dissertations or some combination thereof, and oftentimes working on additional projects beyond the ones that are strictly required to earn your doctoral degree. But certainly at minimum, there's those things like the dissertation and other things where you have to be oftentimes taking the lead in a first author capacity on research, and that necessarily will take time, and completing those program milestones in a timely manner is very important because that is essential for being able to matriculate through the program. APA accreditation does not let us allow students to languish forever on research projects. You have to show forward momentum and otherwise go on a remediation plan if that's not happening, to help you get up to speed and stay on track and on time. So, when you're in a doctoral program too, there still remains this pressure to be able to put in the time to research. And so yet again, there is this pressure to not reduce number of hours spent on research because you have to do these program requirements, or you have to set yourself up to be a competitive applicant to get into doctoral programs. So you can see at this point, having reviewed these different domains, these are some of the factors, the complex set of factors that shape why grad students are so busy and why it's so hard to reduce that busyness for a host of structural and policy and procedure and licensure and accreditation and internship reasons.